Hello, everyone, and welcome. Today, we're going to talk about some basics around IBP and S&OP and enable them inside Demantra or Demand Management Cloud. So let's just get started. About myself, I think most of you have heard me speak before, but I'll do it quickly. My name is Nadav Ziblin. I joined the Demantra team in Israel. Well, it's been 20 years last week. As part of Demantra, I was in consulting, development, and as part of prior to the Oracle acquisition, I was in the product management team. Roughly 3.5 years ago, I ended my tenure at Oracle as a director of product management for Demand Management Cloud and Demantra, and since then I've been a managing partner at Analytical Factor. So let's just dive on it. So what really is S&OP or IBP? What it really is a process. You can adopt in various degrees and ways, but the crux of it, at least on the demand side as I see it, is realigning the tactical plans for the different parts of the business, including sales, marketing, finance, supply chain, and trying to bring everyone together. And it really is about a multidisciplinary, collaborative planning process. Essentially, looking at organizations that traditionally every silo has their own forecast, their own numbers they track to, and those numbers can be wildly divergent from one another, and trying to bring everyone together to have a productive and informative discussion, and ideally at the end of it to be better aligned and executing to a single vision whenever possible. So why do we want to do this? Or why are organizations keen to take this up? The first thing is to identify and react to gaps. And the more classic gap is the corporate leadership and the finance teams believe they're going to sell $50 million next quarter. Sales believe they're going to sell $62 million next quarter, and planning is making enough product to cover $42 million next quarter. Well, one or more of these groups is wrong, and that mistake or that error can be very, very costly. So you want to identify these differences and gaps and close them. You want to let folks make more informed and effective decisions, and you want to have a platform where you can discuss different scenarios. Is COVID-19 going to go away at the end of May? Is it going to continue till September? Is it going to recur in December? Different scenarios can impact your business in very, very different ways. So having an environment where you can discuss those scenarios, evaluate them, and based on that make some business decisions is critical. And again, it's a process. And as part of a process, you want to have very clear definitions of who's responsible for what the accountability is, and just generally how are we doing things together. Going from an ad hoc, everyone does their best, but we sometimes miss, into a much more codified, structural, that is easier to maintain, understand, and follow. Some common benefits of IBP, and I know they're not quite synonymous, but in my mind, the S&OP and IBP are very, very similar. This is some research Oracle has done, but Gartner and others have done also similar research. It could lead to dramatic reductions in inventory, better order fill rates, reduction in working capital, better planning cycles, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of benefits, and it's a matter of making it happen. So why are we talking about this today, though? Well, we're in the middle of a global pandemic. Hopefully, for many countries, we're at the tail end of it, but we don't know. And this pandemic has had dramatic, often negative, sometimes positive impact on businesses, but definitely dynamic shifts in supply chain. So the need to do things more effectively, more accurately, and especially with the fact that many, if not all of us, are remote working, bringing different people together in a process, a platform, becomes more important than ever. So some things that we've seen our customers and just the general literature about COVID-19. So demand behavior has changed dramatically. For some accounts, it's spiked. So some accounts, it's dropped down to near zero. There's potentially shortages of supplies, especially across international vendors, or as plants close. Shall we mute people? Okay. We've got, again, workforce disruptions, and potentially some of your resources aren't as available. And there's just a lot of uncertainty. So at this day and age, it's extremely important to bring all the stakeholders together and realize your plan might not even be perfect, but at least you've all discussed it. You're all aware of each other's assumptions, limitations, leanings, and you come out of it with one plan for the business. From a demand planning perspective, really that's what I think people need to take away from S&OP. You want to have one cohesive plan for the business. So how is this done? Classically, there's a demand review meeting. I had an old colleague of mine who would tell a story about his planning days when he worked in industry, and he said, yes, we had a monthly S&OP meeting, and it took us 6 weeks to get ready for it. So you can appreciate the irony. But this demand review meeting really is a matter of bringing the different groups together. So typically it's going to be sales, marketing, finance, planning. Might be others, but those are classically the groups you want to bring in, and identify gaps. Gaps between the goals of the company, which might be the financial forecast, the sales forecast, which is what the sales team believes are going to be able to sell, the planning forecast, which might be what the planning group believes is going to happen, or what the planning group can deliver on. Maybe the sales forecast is great, but the planning group says, look, even if I've got 3 shifts running 24/7, I can't get enough products on the shelf to meet this. So it's really important to bring everyone together and identify those gaps. Until you identify those gaps, you can't do anything about them. Now, once you identify the gaps, it's time to talk about opportunities and vulnerabilities. Where do we have an opportunity to sell more than we thought we could? Where do you have vulnerability where we can't meet the demand requirements, or we've got supply constraints? So it's about looking at these gaps and then seeing how do we bridge them, and where as a group we have opportunities. So this would be a great platform for a sales team to say, look, if we run 2 more promotions at this account, we believe we can increase demand by another 300,000 units. And that's going to help us meet our financial targets for the year. Then they can turn to planning and say, if we do that, and it's 6 weeks from now, can we have enough product on the shelf? Planning can evaluate some scenarios and say, yeah, I can meet that, but how about we shift it from this product group to this product group? Because we've got a bunch of inventory of this other product group. So if we can shift this, it'll be better for us as a business. You want to capture the assumptions you have. So understand some of the decision-making process. If, let's say, the forecast is being revised up by 300,000 units because the sales team is suggesting having some promotions, you need to make a note of this and have auditability to understand, oh, this is why we're bumping up the forecast, and if for whatever reason we decided the company we're not going to run this promotion, well, the forecast needs to go back to what it was. We can't just expect 300,000 units to materialize. And I said it already, but I'm going to say it again and again. The gauge, in my mind, at least one of the primary gauges of success for a demand review meeting is at the end of it, all the different groups walk out with a single number they understand is what you're executing to as a company. Now, it doesn't mean you're always going to like it. Not sometimes, often enough, different parts of the organization are going to have very different opinions. But you need a platform where you can voice those opinions, capture the assumptions, capture the different expectations that what's going to happen, and then you say, well, okay, so we're going to run these promotions. I'm pessimistic that we're going to drive this much demand, but you know what? Sales feels very strongly about this. Okay, let's give this a shot. Let's execute. In my mind, the meeting is a failure if everyone sits down and says, all right, yeah, we're going to meet for 300,000 units, and everyone goes back and finance goes, well, my target's still 20% more than that. I think we're going to do better. Finance says, yeah, they're never going to execute. I'm not going to make this product. That's a fail. We really need to, as a group company, when you're doing these meetings, say, all right, we've agreed on this number. We're going to execute to it. And sometimes it's not going to be a hit. It's going to be a miss, and we need to learn from that and going forward, do better with it. So now let's talk about some challenges of the demand review process. You want to bring in information from a variety of stakeholders. Ideally, you don't want everyone coming in with an Excel sheet or a printout and discussing things ad hoc. You want to have a collaborative platform where all this information is available based on permissions and security. Whoever's supposed to see this information can see this information whenever they want. So most of you who are planners, if you as a planner want to see what the sales, marketing, and financial forecasts for a product group for the next quarter is, you should be able to see it kind of ad hoc. Why? Because if you're planning for X and finance is expecting X plus 50%, it'd be really good to know. You can either try to convince them that their number is unreasonable, or you need to understand where they're expecting that and see if there's anything that can be done to meet that. You want a platform that supports evaluating several scenarios and seeing what the general impact of those. You want the ability to not just see your values, but see how they changed over time. There's nothing more frustrating than having a forecast you felt comfortable with. You come in 4 days later, the forecast is different, or the sales numbers have suddenly spiked up. The finance forecast is only 20% down. You're like, what happened? I have a screenshot, but something's changed. So the ability to see when things change, and especially why things change, is really powerful and something you need to have. And we talked about these gaps. And the ability to quickly and effectively identify those gaps is critical. Other challenges is the different groups are going to have different forecasts. It's quite natural to distrust each other's forecasts, at least initially. So you need a platform and a mechanism to track that forecast and see how good it is. You want to be very open to accepting and interacting with additional demand signals. And just like any other system, if you can't do the job effectively or quickly enough, it's not going to be beneficial. So if it takes you 6 weeks to plan for a monthly S&OP cycle, something's wrong and your tool is not supporting what you're trying to do. So let's talk about different ways to approach this. And this is something that's been done in Demantra, and I'll also show how it's been done in IBP. So it's very easy to set up a framework where you can see different forecasts side by side. It doesn't mean that the forecasts were all generated in the same way. Chances are your planning forecast came bottoms up, product at, let's say, account, maybe even by week. while the sales forecast came in at the product group account, while the financial forecast comes in at the quarter level for, I don't know, a product family. The forecast could come from a variety of sources. And Demantra gives you the framework to view them side by side and quickly just kind of analyze them. Best practice I would recommend, review the forecast at the level which is kind of common to all of them. So if finance brings you a quarterly product category or product family level forecast, seeing after that forecast gets put down to the product going, oh, your forecast of this product looks weird to finance, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So if you're all reviewing this information together, I'd recommend going up to the most aggregate level. So if planning has granularity X, sales has a more aggregate view of the world, finance has a more aggregate view of the world. When you're talking about the numbers together, talk about them at the most aggregate level of the three. So let's say the finance numbers. The numbers could have come from a variety of levels, but when you're talking about them and comparing them, look at them at a fairly aggregate level. So just this is a real game changer for a lot of companies. Instead of coming into this monthly meeting and saying, what do you mean you've got 80,000? I've got 92,000. And just spending a lot of time talking about where did you get your numbers, where did they come from? If you have a platform that shows you this is the number for sales, for finance, for planning, and this is our current as an enterprise consensus forecast numbers, it's really easy to see where there's differences. And interested stakeholders can investigate those differences ahead of time, and the amount of surprises you're going to get is going to be dramatically reduced this way. If you really want to know what the sales number is for next month, you can go in and take a look at it. If it makes sense to you, great. If it's not aligned with your planning number, maybe you just decide to adjust your planning number. So be it. Or you can give someone a call, send them a message, and say, hey, what's going on with your number? It seems really, really out of touch with what I'm expecting. And then they might convince you, or you might have a productive conversation. But just the ability to see these numbers together is very, very powerful. And while I believe in the Demantra engine, here it doesn't really matter where these numbers come from. Each group has their number. They reached it in one of many ways. But as long as you bring it here in a collaborative environment that's web-based and the right folks can see it whenever they want, it's very, very powerful. DM Cloud can do very, very similar things, just like the Demantra. You do get access to better visualizations, and for folks who are trying to weave more of a story and have to be more KPI and metric driven, you've got the info tiles, which are pretty nice. It's these areas up here, and as you click on each area, the bottom area here, it changes with the relevant information. So there's some nice visualization in that. Now, let's see, before we get here. Now, something I didn't touch on, both Demantra and Oracle Cloud offerings have S&OP applications, and they're good applications. We're not saying what we're talking about today replaces those applications. What we are saying is, if you've already got a demand planning solution and you're struggling as an enterprise to manage your expectations, your plans, and just your forecasting process, especially in the era of COVID-19, look at incorporating some of these concepts in your existing software packages. Why? You'll just reap you'll reap quicker benefits. It'll be something that can put them together in days or weeks instead of implementing a brand new piece of technology. Okay. So a big part of a productive IBP process is evaluating scenarios. It could be as simple as, hey, do we run this event or not 2 months from now? That scenario. It could be more complicated, like, when is COVID-19's impacts going to end, and what are the impacts going to be? It could be much more complicated. Like, I'm expecting different disruptions to my international supplier capacities over the next 12 to 18 months. And I want to evaluate how that's going to impact my product availability and my profitability. So there's lots of different scenarios you could evaluate, and as a company to decide what are the most relevant, likely, and critical scenarios you want to look at. But part of this process is focused around looking at different scenarios. Based on the scenarios you're trying to look at, you might need to leverage different tools. If it's, do I run an event or not, Demantra might be a great solution for that. If you're talking about supply chain disruption, you might need to also bring in other tools or a supply planning solution. So it really comes down to what you're trying to evaluate. Something that we do want to stress is in planning, especially when I think of planning, it's very easy to become accustomed to talking about unconstrained plan, unconstrained demand. Well, sadly, in the real world, that's not what we end up dealing with. So it's a matter of, can you bring in not just your unconstrained forecasts from marketing, finance, and planning, but also bring in a constrained forecast based on either the planning forecast or whichever one you want to look at. But really look at a constrained forecast and identify gaps. Again, this is potentially an area that could be dangerous to the company. We've got demand at risk. We don't believe we can meet this demand because we've got shortages on supply or manufacturing capacity or something stuck in port. So looking at constrained versus unconstrained is a really important part of scenario evaluation. So don't forget about that. Now, creating alternative scenarios in Demantra, there's a few easy to do things. One, if you're trying to just kind of drive different scenarios for the forecasting engine, I'm going to get pulled off 1,000 stores, and I've got store count as a causal factor, or I'm going to modify pricing, or I'm going to run an event. That's something you can simulate and do what if with Demantra very easily, very effectively, easy to do. You can also build the framework pretty quickly to have different scenarios in Demantra. I've seen companies, instead of having a single forecast, say, we're going to bring in my optimistic, my pessimistic, and my likely to happen forecast. And I'm going to store them side by side. And I'm going to track how we're doing against them, and just to be aware of what my upside, my potential downside is, and just to facilitate that conversation. If you want to go even more sophisticated, you can use constructs like general levels and really have different scenarios in place. For example, you could have scenarios based on big deals coming in from your key customers and layer them on top of each other and say, I'm going to keep all these scenarios in the mix, and as to become more or less likely, I'm going to disable or enable them. There's different things you could do to track scenarios and really evaluate, well, if this happens, what's the impact to my business? Well, if something else happens, what's the impact to my business? This is an area where also the demand management cloud is quite powerful. Something Demantra doesn't have is a concept of, at least natively, is a concept of a plan, which is something that came from, let's say, more the supply planning arena at Oracle, but as part of the transition to the cloud was something that was adopted across the value chain planning suite, meaning that in your demand management cloud, you've got this construct called plan. It typically defines, hey, this is the population I'm planning for, and I use in my planning cycle. But what it's very, very useful for is also in scenario planning. You could have your optimistic, pessimistic, and likely to happen plans. Each one can have a different forecast in it, and you can very easily duplicate plans, to create alternate scenarios. You can very easily compare between plans using some of the available UI tools. So leveraging this concept of plan is very, very powerful if you're trying to do scenario planning. You can also do what-if simulations, just like you could in Demantra, and the framework to support more revisions of the simulations there. So Demantra definitely has capabilities. Demantra is also better at allowing you to reject statistical simulations that you didn't like, but the cloud, from plan maintenance and having multiple simulations side by side, is a pretty powerful framework. Okay, lack of accountability and compliance. So in a perfect world, we wouldn't need this. Forecasts would change, everyone would trust it, everyone would be happy with the changes, and things would be wonderful. But in reality, often enough, especially if there's lots of stakeholders, lots of moving pieces, and now with COVID, people being out, people needing to cover for them, there's a lot of changes and like just things that need to be reviewed. And there's nothing worse than coming in the morning and being going, well, my forecast used to be 12,000 units. It's not 12,000 units anymore. I need to know why. So that's where audit trail comes in. Audit trail, when you look at an editable cell, you can click on the audit trail button and essentially see this value was 4,000. It changed to 3,800. On this, these are the dates it happened, and you can see some additional information. So you can easily see this series changed from X to Y and when and at what level it was done. Maybe this was done at an aggregate level. Maybe the entire brand was bumped down by 5%. You go, okay, that must have been the account manager. Great. Also, you've got the concept of notes. So if you want to be really, really transparent and help anyone else using the system understand what you're doing or why you did something, you've got the concept of notes. So you can see who entered the note, you'll see a note icon, and you'll also see the text of the note. So for example, here, the forecast was shifted down because of competitive pressures. So you go, okay, we made a shift, it happened at the brand level, it was because of competitive pressures. Fine. If I want to know more, I know who made the override, I can reach out to them and I can find out what's going on. So just the ability to not just see a number, but understand where it comes from does help collaboration. It helps you trust the forecast better. And at the end of the day, we need to know who changed something and when that information is available. DM Cloud does it a little differently, but again, it's a very similar mechanism. You can have notes and you can have an audit trail where you can see what was changed. So we had 75, it got changed to 50, what levels it changed at, and who changed it. So that's all very useful, just to have that information. Hopefully you don't need it very often, but when you do need it, it's extremely useful. All right. Now, potentially the most important part of a quick and efficient IBP process is identifying and bridging gaps. And it would be great if this is something that all organizations could leverage, not just part of IBP, but in general, because we're all doing more with less. Meaning that I think the days of a planner coming in the morning and saying, all right, my weekly or monthly cycle finished, I've got 37,000 SKUs to review, let's start. And just checking each SKU at a time. Most planners out there don't have enough time for this, one. And two, even if you do have enough time, maybe you're blessed and you only have 100 SKUs and go, I can review those in 3 days. That's not the most effective use of your time. So it really comes down to exception reporting. Focusing the user's attention on what they should look at first. We're not saying this is the only thing they should look at, but focus their attention. It might be just show me places where the financial forecast is more than 15% away from my planning forecast. Why? Well, because if we're that far apart, we're definitely going to have an argument when it comes to our demand planning meeting. Or I might just be short on supplies if this forecast comes to fruition. So it's really, really important to quickly and very succinctly hone in on areas where you've got differences. And the exceptions will vary from organization to organization. You might care very specifically on show me where my safety stock is below a specific point, show me where I've got gaps in my forecast, show me places where my error on forecast error is too high. Show me all items that sell more than, I don't know, $50,000 a month. Could be almost anything. But just use this mechanism to focus your attention. It'll help your general planning process, one, but it'll also, from an IBP perspective, really let you have kind of a laser focused attention to where the different stakeholders are not aligned. So it's very, very important. Now, a challenge that everyone I talk to in the IBP process has is, well, I've got my forecast. I've been creating this forecast, or my group has had this methodology for many years. We're comfortable with it. We're the best. It's great. And all these other groups are yahoos. They don't know what they're talking about. Their forecast is garbage, but they're important and they force me to align to it. That's very, very common. Ideally, it's not that way, but that's very, very common. And honestly, when we sat down and looked at it, in different organizations, yes, sometimes there's a systemic skew. Sales teams tend to be optimistic. Planners tend to be a little pessimistic. If any group does generally a better job at forecasting, the answer is it depends. And sometimes it depends for a given brand or a product line or a horizon. It's very rare that one group is always better. But having that discussion is very touchy and sometimes painful. No one wants to say, yeah, my forecast isn't accurate. So what's the key here? The key here really is tracking accuracy and tracking it over time. It's very hard to tell the sales group, hey, on this brand, you guys are consistently over. And we keep making it because you keep telling me you're going to sell it, and then we don't. But if you measure the accuracy of that forecast for a given, let's say, product line, and look, you guys are 45% error month after month, and you're at 40% bias, minus 40% bias, meaning that your forecast is consistently much, much higher than what demand is. Well, now you've got a leg to stand on. You can say, look, the numbers don't lie. You guys are over. And I know at the end of the day, especially if finance is involved, they have the final say, but a lot of people are very data-driven. If you can compellingly show that this is where the accuracy is for the different forecasts, this is how they track over time, and you can show that there's a systemic problem of some of the forecasts, folks are open to change. So very, very important to track accuracy over time. And it's good for everyone to understand where the forecasts come from. Sometimes just explaining to finance or marketing, hey, your numbers come at the product line level. We actually go through SKU by SKU and generate a forecast. We actually look at all these different factors, and we're a roll-up of that. They might become more amenable to understanding where your forecast comes from and accepting it. And yeah, it's really important to just bring these numbers together, track accuracy, and be open to change on your part. Like, I've seen plenty of planning organizations who have had systemic issues with their forecast as well. For example, someone who's classically baking in safety stock into their forecast, because if they're over, well, there's too much inventory, but they don't get an angry phone call. If they're under, even though their inventory levels and their turn cycles are great, they might get an angry phone call. So even subconsciously, they'll start baking in safety stock into their demand values, which isn't the right thing to do, right? So look at the numbers, track them, and that leads to a much more productive and just informed discussion than everyone just saying, I've got my number is perfect, and I just have to convince everyone else about my number. Two areas we've seen a lot of traction where it comes to focusing planners or organizational attention to what they should look at are segmentation and demand sensing. I'm going to talk a little bit about segmentation. Segmentation is about breaking up your world and saying, well, not all my products and all my accounts are equal. Yes, in the utopian world where I have infinite planning time, I want to review everything. I want everything to be perfectly accurate. But in the real world, that's just not possible. So segmentation is all about identifying that there's different parts of your world that you want to treat differently. Treat differently, why? Well, there's a few reasons. One could be, well, I want to focus on, initially, on what drives profitability for my business. Let's say I'm a spare parts service provider for vehicles, and I can carry at least my catalog does, 80,000 different parts. Well, some of these parts, 2016 Honda Civic, door handle, I might need a lot of. A 1969 Ferrari gear shift, yeah, I might make a lot of money when that order comes in, but I get an order once every 24 months. So I shouldn't treat these products the same. I need to segment them, split up my world into populations, and maybe plan them differently. I want to make sure I've got the handles for my Civic in stock. I want to make sure I've got a lot of inventory, and I know I sell a lot, so it's great. On the Ferrari, and similar products, maybe I don't even keep it in stock. Folks who are looking for something like that will understand it's going to take longer for me to provide, and maybe those I go chasing these parts when it's time. So I'll segment my world. I'll make sure my planning team focuses on the products I need to have in hand, and on the products that are less reliable or more sparse, maybe I decide to make a different planning decision. You can use a similar concept from a forecasting perspective. You could say, well, taking the demand management cloud or the Demantra engine and trying to make it forecast all products in the same manner isn't appropriate. Why? If demand is highly variable, demand is sparse, demand is smooth, to get the best accuracy, I probably want to leverage different configurations of forecasting techniques. So something that's done pretty commonly is segmentation of the world and then application of different configurations on those segments. So if you're looking for better forecast accuracy, it's a very powerful tool. But from an IBP perspective, also if you're looking for a way to break down your world into areas of attention, or maybe break down your world into areas where different groups do a better job. You could actually segment your world into, hey, products the sales teams forecast better, products the planning team forecast better. This could have been based on who did a better job in the last 3 months of forecasting those products. And whoever does, we're going to keep that score and use it. So now maybe for the next 3 months, we're automatically going to take the sales team's forecast for the segment they did a good job on and take the planning team's forecast on the Segment data did a good job on. So it's just a different way to split up the world and easily maintain it. Demand sensing. So you've seen a lot of companies out there. While you forecast at a monthly cadence, you often generate a master forecast once a year or once a quarter. And this is kind of the forecast that leadership has bought into, everyone's aligned with, everyone's kind of come up with as part of their IBP process and say, this is the number we've all agreed on, we're tracking to this. Well, what happens when you start getting the real demand signals from the field that don't reflect this? So a lot of organizations are just going to say, well, I look at it, I eyeball it, I shift my forecast around. Some organizations actually say, you know what, I take all my unmaterialized forecasts for, let's say, the quarter, and I shift it to later in the quarter. That happens a lot. Oracle's own Sun team does that. There's a lot of high-tech companies that do things like that, say, all right, whatever didn't come in for the quarter yet, I believe it's still going to come in this quarter, I'm going to shift it. Well, that's fine and dandy for weeks 2, weeks 3, weeks 4. But let's say we're at week 11 of the quarter. Demand's been 800. My predictions for the quarter is 2,500. Well, at some point you have to say, yeah, that 2,500 isn't coming in. So this is where the concept of demand sensing really shines. It's about looking at what demands come in for the period you're interested in, what the forecast that was kind of planned for the period, highlighting differences between the two, and having a mechanism of recourse, whether it's saying, yeah, let's take my unfulfilled forecast and just put it later in the period, whether it's letting the user revise the forecast ad hoc, or it's saying, well, okay, well, my forecast is clearly not accurate. Let's adjust the forecast based on the demand signal I have gotten and the pattern of demand inside the period. So this is something we've done a lot of work around. We've actually created a PaaS extension for DM Cloud. But if anyone's interested in the concept of demand sensing and kind of different methodologies of deploying it, it's something I'm very, very excited to talk about. So just let us know. All right. Last topic, I think, is user adoption. So if folks can't use the tool effectively, or when they run a report, they have to go on an extended coffee break, that's not very productive. It leads to context switching, which I know personally drives me crazy, and it doesn't let folks do what they need to do. So if you're looking at poor performance in your system, there's a variety of things you should think about. So this isn't just targeted at IBP, it's targeted at planning in general. It's more important for IBP because a lot of the IBP stakeholders are less patient than planners. And they like looking at very large swaths of data. So if a planner comes in, runs a report for an account at a product category level, and that's going to return 1,500 products, and they know that's going to take 20 minutes, they'll shrug and they'll wait. It's not ideal, and that should run faster, but it is what it is. If there's a director of sales who has to look across 10 accounts and 20 product lines and want to run that report, and it doesn't come back in 3 minutes, which I know a lot of us will go, well, that's not realistic. Well, they're not going to use the tool. They're not going to go in and review the forecast in the tool. So if you want to make sure all the different stakeholders in IBP do use the tool, go in and look at the information and have more insight on what the other groups are doing, it's really important to have a performance environment. How do you get there? There's lots of different things you can do. A lot of gains could be made around optimized database structures and how you place the tables and indexes, data cleanup from tables to unused data, caching, potentially archiving, saying, you know what, we need 6 years of history in the system, but day-to-day, I only care about 18 months. So what can I archive or shift elsewhere? And this can really have some dramatic improvements. For example, it's determined that someone has a report that takes 10 minutes to run, but you don't need that report to be on live data. And anything that was current this morning is fine. You can run a cached worksheet, and instead of 10 minutes, that will come back in 15 seconds. That's a big, big difference, meaning that you could possibly enable business processes you just didn't think were feasible. You'd say, well, the director of sales isn't going to come in and look at this report. It's going to take 10 minutes to pop up. But if you say, well, the report from data was this morning that we've cached, we'll come back in 15 seconds instead of 10 minutes. Well, that's a very different conversation. Now you can ask them to go into the system, take a look at some things, and have a much more productive discussion. So I want to kind of start wrapping up and leave us a few minutes for questions. So the core of IBP, especially now that we're all remote working, is we want to have a collaborative working environment that doesn't just involve planning. It involves sales and other groups as well. You want to do either manual or more automated what-if simulation analysis. Could be simple simulations, could be very complex simulations, but you want to think about different things and how they're going to impact the business. You want to leverage, whenever possible, the capabilities of audit trails and notes. For example, a lot of groups out there go, oh yeah, we've had notes for years, but we never use them. Well, if you tell people, well, the following 3 scenarios, we expect you to enter a note. Suddenly within a few months, you start getting this really robust collection of information that was made around decisions. We want to focus people's attention on looking at where their time can be spent more wisely and identifying gaps between the different groups of IBP. So that's where exception reports are really, really important. You want to look at how to segment the world, again, to focus people's attention. And if there's parts of your application or business processes you're trying to do, but performance is a factor, you need to think about how to improve those. And one last topic I didn't touch on at all, but if you've got access to consumption demand and your account inventory, these are very, very powerful tools, especially today. You're going to see some wacky shipments and bookings patterns, potentially that aren't reflecting what consumer demand is. Some companies might say, well, I just want to make sure I've got enough. So I'm going to order a ton and put it in my warehouse. Or I'm going to actually even lease another warehouse and just order a bunch. And you might say, all right, great, demand's shifting. We're going to sell a lot of units. Well, that might not be the case. So if you've got access to some of the consumption and account inventory data, definitely start looking at it. If it's something you don't have, I wouldn't rush out to get it. But if you do have it, this might be a great time to start utilizing it. And the final piece I want to finish with is, look, IBP and S&OP is a process, it's a journey, there's a lot to put in place. But these days when you're all stressed, there's a lot of constraints and a lot of just challenges, especially in the current pandemic environment, look at what you can accomplish quickly and easily. It might be as simple as, you know what, these reports will take a long time to run. Let's talk about using cached worksheets and cache them. Or you know what, we keep having these discussions with sales about their forecast. Let's just enter a couple more series, come up with a process that's going to import that sales forecast into the system, and we have it handy. Let's create a couple of exceptions that compare these 2 key fields for us. So when a planner comes in on a Monday morning after the monthly cycle, their attention's focused. So really think about what are going to be quick, easy wins that are going to get you some efficiencies. All right, so that's all I had for today. Shao, or anyone else on the line, if you've got questions, or this would be a perfect time to raise them.
Thank you, Nadav. Nadav, we got already a couple of questions so far.
Okay.
Start with the first one. If I have all these capabilities in the main cloud, why do I need the sales and operation planning?
Okay, interesting question. So we talked about how to support the demand, let's say, review meeting. But S&OP is really could be a lot of different parts of the process. And the S&OP solution of Demantra has some interesting capabilities, including full loop that sends the forecast from Demantra, the unconstrained forecast, into ASCP. It gets constrained and gets sent back. So you get some interesting highlights about resource utilization and constrained versus unconstrained. Demand management is a good tool, but it can enable a process. It doesn't really enforce it. And out of Oracle's cloud tools, the tool I think has had the biggest leap forward from Demantra to cloud has been S&OP Cloud. It's not just a process enablement tool, it's also a process enforcement tool. You can actually set up steps and owners and escalations and due dates. And once you set up that process, every cycle you have a very, very well-defined framework of who needs to do what by when. And that's a very powerful thing. So if you've got those licenses or you've already kind of adopted those technologies, definitely use the full suite of capabilities. But if you don't, going there is going to take you some time. And we want to give you some kind of quick hits and things to think about of things you can put in place on top of your demand planning applications.
Okay, and
anything else?
the other one was from your experience. Can you share what the most common exceptions that your customers are setting up?
Sure. So common exceptions are, from an IBP perspective, is show me scenarios where any group's forecast is more than X%, where X might be 10 or 20% different than someone else's. That's really important. Let's say at the quarter product line level, show me where I've got gaps and focus our attention so we can have that discussion. That's a very common one. Other exceptions that might be of interest is if you've got shipments and bookings, show me some exceptions around where they're very different. It might mean I've got some challenges in my fulfillment capabilities. I need to look at that. Other areas for good exceptions is show me places where, let's say, demand was over X dollars for a month and my forecast accuracy was worse than my, I don't know, this is bad threshold. So this is areas where I know my forecast accuracy is quite bad and this is impactful for the business. So I need to do something about it. Yeah, these are pretty common places folks want to place exceptions. What other interesting exceptions might there be? Show me scenarios where this period's forecast is more than X different than last period's forecast or last period's demand. That's another popular one.
And we got one more.
All right.
Nadav, if we're not doing any of these recommendations, what is the shortest way to implement it, or what should we tackle first?
That's a hard one. So if you don't have any of this in place, what's almost a kind of like the free gimmies are, look at your audit trail and notes. It's there, it's available. Start using it if you need to. A little bit more work, but also not a ton of work, is start using exceptions. It'll really focus the planning team's attention to what they need to look at. And what I just said now, that's good for planning, even if you're not doing IBP. If you're going to tackle IBP in any remotely serious way, the first thing you want to do is bring in the stakeholders into the system, which meaning giving them a place where their forecast can reside, coming up with either a manual or automated process to load that forecast. That's the first step. So definitely look at starting with that.
All right, Nadav, that's all.
Well, I think we're right on time. So everyone who attended, thank you very much for taking the time to join us today. Hopefully this was informative. If you've got some follow-up questions or topics you want to raise, you can reach us at info@analyticalfactor.com or reach out to me directly. We're always happy to talk about these things, especially if you've got any pressing issues or things you're trying to progress with. We're always happy to get on the phone and give you some advice. All right. Take care.
All right. Thank you.